Hello, today we're going to talk about familiar animals and animals in general in the world of witchcraft and spirituality. First of all, let's clear out some things. Often when I go on TikTok, and particularly I go on Witch Talk, I see a lot of videos about animals and their roles, and one of the first figures who's mentioned as a witch with their familiar is the goddess Circe. Circe is a figure from Greek mythology, and she lives in the Italian peninsula, in an island of the Italian peninsula, and she appears in the story of Odysseus. Odysseus fought in the Trojan War, and then he has his own story, coming back from Troy, back to Greece. Originally, he's nearing his home during his travel, but then the gods curse him with a 10-year trip across the Mediterranean and then returns after 10 years. During this trip, during these adventures, he meets with Circe. So originally, his sailors, after multiple misadventures, get in the island looking for food. Circe sees them and curses them and turns them into pigs.
Food. We need food.
Travelers, you look famished. Come, eat. Feast, my guests. By earth and sea be what you deserve.
One of the sailors witnesses the entire thing. He goes back to Odysseus and tells him everything. And Odysseus, being a good companion to his shipmates, he decides to face Circe. On the way to meeting Circe, he encounters the god Hermes, who gives him strategy in order to avoid her curse.
They're gone! She turned them all
into beasts.
I barely escaped.
And I will bring them back.
Odysseus, take this moly. Its power will guard you from her spell.
My thanks, messenger. I won't fail them.
So he gets into the palace. Circe invites him to have some food and drinks. And in the Greek world, anytime you get offered food and drink, it could be tricky. Many times behind the libation, what hides is a trick, something that's going to change your life forever. And he's able to have his libation with Circe, and Circe fully expects him to turn also into a pig. She actually commands him with her staff, and the magic doesn't work on him because he already had the strategies to face this danger. Circe becomes really impressed with him because he's able to face her and threaten her with his word. And she states to him that as long as she is kept safe, she will be able to encounter him biblically separately. So that's what happens. And eventually he commands her to turn his men back into humans, and they return back into the original form. That was actually an improved form as well.
By Olympus, the gods shield you. Then let your men be men again.
And by the end of the time, when he's told to by his men that they need to go back to Ithaca, the place in Greece where they come from, he informs Circe, and she states that she's not allowed to keep him there. However, in order for him to go into his next steps of his adventure, he has to descend into Hades, or the Greek underworld, and she has a task for him.
If you truly wish to see Ithaca again, you must go first where no mortal longs to tread, the land of the dead.
Find the prophet Tiresias. Only he can guide
To
you
Hades
home.
itself.
So let's break down the story a little bit. First of all, when I go into Witch Talk, what I see is that the witches on TikTok call Circe one of the first witches, and they call the animals as her familiars. Circe appears with her own familiars. However, the metamorphosis of the men into pigs doesn't automatically make them familiars. There's more meaning behind the metamorphosis, the change itself from human to pig, rather than more of a familiar meaning. In the Greek world, the idea of a practitioner of magic accompanied by an animal wasn't a strange idea. Many times the animals that accompanied a person would offer clues about the powers or the characteristics of the practitioner. So animals are used effectively as symbols signifying other things. For instance, Hercules fighting the lion. Okay, that's a recurring theme in Greek mythology, representing reason over brute force. But in this case, we cannot necessarily call the pigs as familiars to the goddess Circe. Philosophers and historians have really dwelled into the meaning of the stories. And one of the potential explanation is the metamorphosis. In the Renaissance, this idea of metamorphosis was truly explored by practitioners of esoteric arts such as Giordano Bruno. With metamorphosis, we're talking about a life event that will cause a transformation, that is, an inner transformation of the person. So in the case of Circe and her pigs, the sailors, come back as human, and the reason why they're in the island is because they are hunting for food. So the hunt represents some form of greed towards what nature offers us. So the result, in order for them to learn the lesson about greed, is to turn into animals themselves, and perhaps risking the hunting, receiving the hunting, in order for them to learn the lesson, and afterwards, when they come out of it, the improved form is the practitioner has now achieved new levels of knowledge, and it's almost as if they have achieved a new life. Similar for Odysseus, Odysseus is able to avoid the curse. However, towards the end, the big task wasn't actually to fight Circe or obtain his men back. The big task for him was to descend into Hades, the Greek underworld. The descending into Hades is also a common theme that involves a lot of practitioners. Descending into the underworld means discovering the secrets. In initiation schools, what you're tasked to do is to try to go into a passage from life to not life in order for you to achieve the new knowledge. The practitioner puts together a ritual when the candidate symbolically goes from life to not alive and back to life. And that's what's illustrated in the Odyssey, in this portion of the Odyssey. So I will be careful when you're receiving knowledge from witch talk. I will be careful with jumping into conclusions about familiars and such. I'm both familiar with Greek and Roman mythology due to the fact that my initial part of my education was in Italy, and we studied Latin. We translate a lot of these passages from Latin. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to learn ancient Greek, but a lot of us do. And you also learn the mythology as well. But due to my interest and my ancestry, I also became very familiar with the Nordic stories. And one of the biggest practitioners of magic is the god Odin. Odin is often seen with two ravens, Huginn and Muninn.
Fly, my friends. Bring me every whisper the wind carries. Huginn, Muninn, return when the truth is yours.
When the raven leaves Odin, and that's the idea of the memory leaving, and you hoping as the practitioner for the memory to come back. And this idea is very profound. Many European societies believed in incarnation. And one of the common features of incarnation is that after each life you get into a new shell, a new body, and seemingly you forget the lessons of the previous life. So this idea of the memory coming back is the idea of learning again who you are. And it's interesting that Odin does this with an animal, with a raven. That's indicative of two things. One is the fact that each region will take the animal that is geographically there, and the animal will assume a new meaning. There's also another reason that from ancient times, humans were in contact with animals. Animals were often seen as givers of knowledge. In this case, Huginn and Muninn act as familiars for the god Odin. I'm still a proponent of the fact that the idea of familiar does not appear in European texts until the Inquisition came to be, and we see it more in the 16th century. And we see in this books that the Inquisition wrote that the witches would have a familiar. And often in the description of familiars, they would get really creative. They would look like elongated animals with magical abilities and such. My idea of keeping familiars in your practice is more related to the fact that ancient European tribes were often associated with animals. So what we see in Germanic and Celtic history is that often a tribe will be associated with an animal. Very often it would be the bear or the wolf. There are tribes that take their names from these animals. There are last names that also derive from the name of the animals, and that includes first names as well. We also see boar and eagle. All of those animals took a really important role. In the foundation of Rome, for instance, the two kings, Romulus and Remus, were actually fed by a she-wolf. So the idea of the wolf with the Italic people, the people who lived in the Italian peninsula, is often intertwined. It's as if to say that the wolf is part of your ancestry. So often the animal wasn't necessarily seen as a familiar, but as a part of the ancestry. So that brings me to the next idea. In modern practice, particularly in Wicca, there is often a conversation about totemic animals. And this is a charged idea because the idea of totemic animals comes from the cultures of the Americas, where often the tribes would have a totem. They would build a totem with specific animals, and the animals were representative of the tribes. And this is actually very true in modern practice. This was probably true for the Europeans as well. Many times it would be difficult when the tribe would identify with an animal, but perhaps one person within the tribe could identify with other animals as well. And the key is that the animal that you identify with is essentially the bringer of knowledge and power. So a lot of the characteristics that we assume that animal to have are also characteristics that we're supposed to see in the practitioner of magic. So why is this idea charged? Because there is also a connection with cultural appropriation. I will not give you my opinion on it. What I do know from my practice is that because every time we come to Earth, we take them to new bodies, because there is a collective memory that we share with all humanity, and because we're all part of one, I don't necessarily believe that ideas could belong to one group or another. They're often shared, and we can often see this continuum among cultures, particularly in the worship of animals, or the idea of having an animal as a familiar, or the idea of having an animal that acts as a guide into your spiritual path. We see it across cultures globally. So that becomes more a matter of verbiage. Perhaps you don't want to use the verbiage that we used to use in the Americas. Perhaps you want to use more of a European verbiage, and I believe that's perfectly okay. I've often suspected that some of the pets I've had in my life were often acting as familiars. Many times, especially during struggles, my pet has been a source of motivation and knowledge and a guide that has guided me through struggle. So for that reason, I believe that having a pet, and that I consider as my child, my own child, is a form of, it's actually helpful for your growth as a person and your growth as a spiritual practitioner. When it came to totemic animals, the first time I became familiar with this idea was through the book of Silver and Raven Wolf. And I read that book in Italian. It's about beginner stuff within witchcraft, particularly within Wicca. I did a very simple ritual. Often these rituals include a white candle, a very simple spell that you recite. And that's what I did. I blessed some stones, I blessed some herbs. I recited a spell where I was inviting my spirit guides to show me my totemic animals throughout the day. That means throughout the following 24 hours. So this was an interesting experience because nothing happened during the ritual. As you can see, many people who practice magic, they often expect immediate results, and that wasn't the case. There have been situations where I've had immediate results, but that wasn't it. So that night I went to bed, and around 3 a.m. I wake up after a nightmare. In my nightmare, I was waking up. By the way, I was 14, so still living with my parents. I woke up within the dream and walked into the bathroom. I opened the door of the bathroom, and this goddess comes out of the toilet, surrounded by snakes. And that was a really frightening dream, so that woke me up. And I didn't make much about it until the following morning. I decided to leave the house. Approximately 15 hours after I did my ritual. And as I opened the main door, there is a snake, there is a viper just sitting there. Eventually, my dad is able to chase that away. But when I saw that, I essentially put two and two together. I had a dream first about snakes, and the first animal that appears after my ritual was indeed a snake. And I didn't know what the snake meant in my life. For me, the snake was about shedding the old and obtaining the new. The snake is about immortality because the snake consistently renews itself. So in the practice of spirituality, we often encounter this idea that we are limited beings with an immortal soul that makes us divine. And because of that, the snake was the connection between myself and the divinity, between myself and chasing this idea of something better, something above us. Time goes by, and that afternoon I see an eagle fly. And eagles are a rare sight in Sicily. We do have eagles. They mostly live on Mount Etna, but generally they don't venture much outside of the park. They're a protected species. They originally went extinct, I believe, and I think there was a reintroduction effort that allowed the eagles to come back. So there was another interesting sight, and that was my second animal. So after that, I didn't see any more animals, but throughout my life, many of them were revealed through random events. So some of my totemic animals are the wolf, the bear. The wolf and the bear both have ancestral connections. I have, in my ancestry, I have tribes that lived in northern Germany, southern Denmark, Sweden, and those tribes were often associated with the bear. I'm also Italian, and the Romans have this connection with the wolf as well. Those animals were revealed to me via dreams and meditations, and often by coincidence. Many times you are asking for a guide, and perhaps you're reading a passage, and there it is. The passage is about a wolf, or the passage may be about a bear. Later on, I realized that I also had a connection with most horned animals, particularly the moose. When I practice with any animal within the deer family, that often is for me a bridge between myself and the ancestral spirit, between this side and the other side. And that has to do with the symbol that the animal has. So the horns themselves, they point above. So the points are the connection between above and below, just like the Hermetic school of thinking suggests. Just like the Hermetic school of thinking suggests, as above, so below. So for me, anytime there is an animal of the deer family, that's what it reminds me of. And because I connect a lot with Norse and Celtic cultures, I have a strong connection with the moose. So the word for moose in Old Norse is elgur. And we see this in modern Nordic languages where elg, and even in English elk, they're part of the same family. Elk and moose essentially are both part of the family Alces. So in Old Norse, the elg actually has the same, if you look at the shape of the horns, has the shape of a specific rune. Algir is this representation between our world and the next world. So many times when you encounter a moose, that's divine presence. That's the spirit world opening in front of you. In Celtic cultures, when you see a horned animal, such as a deer, often what the deer represents is the connection with the fairy world. There's a lot of mythology about people within the Irish culture going into the forest and finding this opening into the fairy world. And some people have a positive experience with the fairies. The fairies are bringers of knowledge and luck. But there's also a lot of fear-mongering about the fairies, and I believe this has to do with the advent of Christianity in the island, where all guides were essentially turned into demons. But often still in the Celtic world, whenever you see a white stag particularly, that's the connection between the physical realm and the fairy world. And that tells you the fairies are near. If you like more videos like this, make sure you like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you.